I'm really excited to be speaking at Hint Summit 2D this year on a very important subject matter near and dear to my heart, and you'll know why in just a moment. But you're here to hear me talk about the secret system that no one is talking about. But I've actually titled this presentation, The Secret System That We Must Talk About and the Revolution of One. So I'm actually going to go off video myself so everyone can draw their attention to the slides, and we'll go ahead and get started. So first, my background. For those who do not know who I am, I'm one of 4 doctors, Doctors Knox, and sometimes we go by the cuter version, the Knox docs, and we're a family of medical doctors hailing from conventional medicine. We have backgrounds in emergency medicine. That's my dad in the middle, spent 40 years in the emergency department. Anesthesia, my mom right next to him, Dr. Janice, spent 32 years as a board certified anesthesiologist. And then I myself on the right, in the green, have a background of family and integrative medicine, and my sister in the blue, Dr. Jessica, has a background in preventative medicine. But we don't practice in these conventional fields these days. And I'll get to that at the end of this presentation. But in short, we are the founders of the American Cannabinoid Clinics. The word cannabinoid kind of gives the secret sauce away, and Advent Academy. And we are pioneers of functional and integrative endocannabinology. The secret system, right? There is a system in our bodies that nobody is talking about. We know a lot about these systems, right? We know about the circulatory system, the pulmonary and skeletal systems, our muscular system, and many other systems, and our nervous system that we all once thought controlled, and many of us still do, right? Believe control everything else. But today I want to talk to you about this system. Now, this system was discovered almost 25 years ago, really between the years of 1988 and 1995. And it's a system that is more important, truly, than every other system in respect that it controls every other system. It is totally unlike those systems that we all are so familiar with, and it is supreme to those systems. But, right, discovered back in 98, 95, within that time frame, it was left out of our textbooks. And I'll get into why in a second, but I do want to say that we benefit tremendously from our advancing technologies in medicine, right? But people used to be great at healing themselves, right? People used to use natural substances and practices like herbs, like acupuncture, like yoga and meditation, right? And these ancient healers knew that these things worked in the treatment of dis-ease, but they didn't really understand why, right? They didn't have sound theories as to why, because they lacked the science. But we know now that there is a biophysical model demonstrating why those ancient practices work. And the answer was hidden in this system the whole time, and it's the endocannabinoid system. So what do we need to know about this system? Well, the endocannabinoid system resides inside the bodies of all animals except the insects. It's a 600 million year old messenger and receptor system that is integral to balance within all of our bodies. From embryonic development to immunosurveillance and everything in between, there is no function in our body that isn't somehow modulated by this system, the endocannabinoid system. We like to talk about it as a maestro to the symphony of all the other physiological systems in our body. Sometimes we talk about it as a switchboard functioning in and across every physiological system. But its purpose is to react to internal and external stimuli, to direct, correct, and oversee the functioning of that body, again, to the tune of homeostasis or balance. So how does it do this? So although a gross simplification, the endocannabinoid system is commonly broken down into 4 components. First, we have our cannabinoid receptors. The first 2 receptors discovered were cannabinoid receptor 1 and cannabinoid receptor 2. Next, we have the ligands, right? The keys that fit into those receptors. And these ligands bind to these endogenous cannabinoid receptors to turn on downstream effects or off. And then lastly, we have the synthesizing enzymes that create these endocannabinoids, these ligands, on demand when they're needed, but also that break them down after their use. So these are the four critical components that describe the endocannabinoid system that was discovered between 1988 and 1992. And especially in the nervous system, this is how the endocannabinoid system works. So it works through something called retrograde signaling. So illustrated in this diagram is the route of an endocannabinoid, right? If you go down to that postsynaptic neuron, it is made right there in that postsynaptic neuron, and it actually travels backwards or retrograde across the synapse to the presynaptic neuron where it binds to a cannabinoid receptor, and this is where it initiates an action, right? In this case, in this diagram, it blocks the release of the neurotransmitter. And so I can simplify that further in an analogy we often use. We like to think of the endocannabinoid system as an apartment building. So when your neighbor across the hall gets a little too loud, you know, what will we do? We'll go and ask them to politely turn their volume down. So it's easy to imagine with this feedback loop or mechanism how incredibly important this function is when cells are sending aberrant signals of pain, stress, or inflammation, right? So like a noisy neighbor, these are signals that need to be checked. And it's through this feedback mechanism that the ECS does that. It checks processes back into balance, helping the body, and this is coined in the world of cannabis medicine, to help the body relax, eat, sleep, forget, and protect itself. This is our homeostatic mechanism at the cellular level. This is what controls all of our mediating and restorative processes. In sum, the endocannabinoid system keeps our body in balance. If the system is so incredibly important, you know, why was it left out of our textbooks? Why are medical schools still not teaching it? This is why. Because cannabis was used to discover it. So back in the 80s, and remember I mentioned the system was discovered beginning in 1988. Well, back in the 80s, researchers wanted to know how THC worked. In 1985, actually, our federal government approved Marinol. If you're familiar with Marinol, synthetic THC, approved Marinol for use for symptoms of chemotherapy, right? Nausea and vomiting, also wasting disease like that of AIDS, but they didn't know how it worked. So researchers used a radio-tagged THC and discovered how it worked. THC, through that radio labeling, lit up a receptor system throughout our body, right? Well throughout the brain, well throughout the rest of the body. And THC acted this way, they found out after the fact, because it's a direct analog or mimicker of an endogenous cannabinoid that our body makes on its own. This is AEA, or anandamide. Anandamide, very interestingly, is also known as the bliss molecule. The root word ananda means bliss in Sanskrit. And this is what's actually responsible for the runner's high, not endorphins, which is always a mind-blowing concept when I get to present that. And we're learning more and more each day how other hundreds of phytocannabinoids from cannabis and other plants mimic and have potential to supplement or modulate the endocannabinoid system in healing ways. So this is where we're at, right? We have this mind-blowing system, and I just reviewed this plant that works on this system in mimicking ways to our own endogenous cannabinoids that are involved in homeostasis. So what is wrong with that? Right? Why haven't we been taught this? Well, it's because of this. I'm going to take you down really, really quick history lesson. The answer lies deep within history, and please, in your spare time, dive deep into the congressional records. Look up the Flexner report, which I have here on the left on this slide, because this is where the answer lies, right? Ideologues and industrialists around the turn of the 20th century decided that they needed to do something about the homeopaths and the chiropractors and those practicing ancient, traditional, classical medicine, it couldn't figure out why they wouldn't prescribe their drugs, right? So with hundreds of millions of dollars in their pockets, along with this document, the Flexner Report, they had the full force of governments behind them, and American medical training became standardized in accordance with pharmaceutical drug science. And this really was to the exclusion of holistic care practices and natural remedies and cures. They created this system, right, that made patentable pharmaceutical drugs easy to prescribe, easy to sell, while making holistic practices and unpatentable plant medicine like cannabis pretty fringe and ultimately illegal. And what's also really surprising to most medical providers is that US physicians prescribed cannabis to their patients regularly well into the 20th century. It actually landed on the American Pharmacopoeia in 1850. And cannabis was once a top 3 most commonly prescribed drug at its time. But its use dwindled with heavy taxation. The doctors were prosecuted for its use, and it was finally removed from the American Pharmacopoeia in 1942. And another trivia point is that the American Medical Association actually testified before Congress to request that cannabis be studied instead of removed. But at the end of the day, it's big business, right? The ideologues, the industrialists who felt threatened by not just cannabis as medicine, but as cannabis or hemp as an industrial product. And they wept cannabis really out of our consciousness as an industrial, agricultural, nutritional, and yes, even medicinal tool. So I like to say that big business wrote our medical textbook, and that's why this information is not shared with us. And I personally can only speculate that the endocannabinoid system was kept a secret because the science validates the use of unpatentable plant medicine and practices like cannabis. Big pharma and big business really have disrupted what I call a once free market of health, where we Americans had agency over what we chose to use for our health. And so today we look like this, really. We willingly spend millions and millions of dollars, day after day, month after month, year after year on unhealthy foods, in addition to the prescription drugs we reflexively prescribe and depend on, right? And both of these are ticely linked to endocannabinoid system dysfunction, which is, again, the system that keeps us in balance. So if it becomes out of balance, it becomes the precipitant to almost all disease. And as a result of this cycle here, we know that Americans are getting sicker and sicker. The responsibility of our health truly has been outsourced to these spaces, right? And they've been cashing in at our expense, right? I call this the industrial health complex. But as powerful and resilient as the endocannabinoid system is, it is not immune to these things, right? The aging, the assaults of modern day living, low quality foods, chronic pharmaceutical drug use, environmental pollutants and toxins, emotional stress, and how all of those things interplay on our genetics, right? This system, again, the 600-million-year-old system that is principal, right, core to our very being, regulating our balance and homeostasis, as a resilient system can be tripped into dysfunction and out of balance, right? So these things are the common causes of endocannabinoid system dysfunction, and they really do need to be avoided. And I know I'm speaking to the choir here. We need to advise patients to get rid of these things, from their personal lifestyle arsenal or significantly reduce them. But on the flip side, there are things that we can do to nurture and restore our endocannabinoid system. Right? Eating real food. Our foods provide the basic building blocks of healthy cells, including raw materials to make our endogenous cannabinoids. And real quickly, I want to make a note here that endogenous cannabinoids are not made on their own. They require us to eat the foods that build them, principally our PUFAs, or omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids, which ironically, the perfect ratio of those fatty acids reside in the hemp seed. Also supplements like adaptogenic herbs and spices. These further to what I call soothe and tone the endocannabinoid system and aid in balance restoration. Detoxification, right? Cleansing the body, reducing inflammation. That's another way to tone the ECS back into function. Incorporating what I call cannabimimetics. Those are practices that stimulate the endocannabinoid system, like acupuncture and yoga and deep breathing and exercise. Remember I mentioned endogenous cannabinoids are actually responsible for the runner's high and not our endorphins. And phytocannabinoids as well, like THC, which mimics an endogenous cannabinoid, or CBD that blocks the breakdown of our endogenous cannabinoids. And lastly, maintaining healthy relationships, right? Creating reasons to smile, hug often. Interestingly, it turns out when we smile and hug at one another, right, that triggers the release of endogenous cannabinoids as well, principally anandamide, again, that bliss molecule. So, in very, very short, because I would love to have spent a lot of time digging into the deep science with you all. But in short, we just have to choose one. And as medical providers, right, oftentimes we're trying to meet our patients where they're at, and trying to identify things that they can do in their lifestyle, not just through the prescriptions that we provide them, to help restore health, right? I became a doctor because I wanted to help people heal. And unfortunately, the conventional Western system doesn't give us many tools to do that. And here is our opportunity to do so. So just choose one, right? Start with real food. Start with natural whole supplementation. Start with detoxification. Start with some cannabimimetics. Go take your shoes off outside and ground, right? And always, always prioritize healthy relationships. So I did choose one. I chose cannabis. And this is my revolution of one. So I mentioned before that my family, there's 4 docs in my family, have really left the conventional world to focus on pioneering with other medical professionals like ourselves, the nascent fields of cannabinoid medicine and endocannabinology. And so in other talks that I give, we review these terms, so I'll review them with you now too. Cannabinology is simply the study of the pharmacology of cannabinoids and cannabimimetic substances. Other cannabimimetic substances other than cannabis, right, are things like essential oils, which are chock full of aromatic compounds called terpenes. These terpenes have pharmaceutical effects of their own, and in the cannabis plant, they actually create something called an entourage. So in our practice, we talk not just about cannabinoids, but also other substances, herbs, spices, essential oils that can also harness the power of the endocannabinoid system. Next is endocannabinology, which is the study of the endocannabinoid system, its dysfunction, and its modulation by cannabimimetic practices. And lastly, what we practice, functional and integrative endocannabinology, which is the application of integrative excuse me, medicine to correct endocannabinoid system dysfunction at their root cause. Sounds like functional medicine, using natural medicines and alternative health modalities. And in my role over the past 5 years in this space, this is how I've activated my revolution, right? We founded our American Cannabinoid Clinics, which is a direct care model, out of an academy to train other medical professionals in endocannabinology and cannabinoid medicine. I'm currently the chair of our Oregon Cannabis Commission because it's critical that we start regulating cannabis to the tune of medicine so that we can mitigate risk on one hand and optimize experience on the other. This is my call to action for medical professionals to understand that we have this role to play in our patients' life who are choosing cannabis as medicine. And then I have some other things up here because advocacy and leadership are critical right now as regulators and legislators and business people are writing the laws around cannabis as medicine. And so what will be your revolution of one? I want to know this, but I do, again, call to action and activation upon my fellow medical peers to learn endocannabinology and apply that to our practices.
Thank you, Dr. Knox. So if it's okay with you, we have a couple of questions.
Absolutely.
So question 1 would be kind of curious about your thoughts on the physiological actions of CBD versus THC.
Well, they're very different, right? So This talk was adapted from my TED Talk, so it was just lightning, and I wasn't able to dive into the science in particular. But I'm constantly having to re-educate all of us on the difference between THC and CBD. CBD does not bind directly to our endogenous or cannabinoid receptors like THC does, right? THC binds directly to CB1 and CB2. Its binding to CB1 is what activates the euphoria that folks feel when they use cannabis and intoxication. And I said before, it mimics one of our endogenous cannabinoids, anandamide. But because anandamide is built on demand and broken down on demand, it doesn't sit on the receptor. But if it did, it would cause that euphoria. It would cause that intoxication, right? The runner's high. That's what's happening there. CBD binds indirectly, right, to the CB1 receptor, and then 65 other non-cannabinoid receptor targets. So we call CBD the promiscuous molecule because it does that. But anyways, when it binds to CB1, it actually changes the conformation of that receptor. And that's why people say that CBD and THC are better together than alone. It's one of the reasons. But we do believe that it's binding indirectly to the CB1 receptor is the reason why when CBD is on board, folks are less likely to feel euphoric, less likely to get intoxicated, right? And when we have hemp-derived CBD products with next to no THC, that's the reason why we're not experiencing, again, the intoxication and the euphoria. Now, CBD and THC have overlapping pharmacological effects. And, you know, in some ways, we like to talk about the entourage that is the overlapping effects of phytocannabinoids and other phytochemicals like terpenes and flavonoids, which are the predominant phytochemicals that are found in cannabis. Interestingly, they're all psychoactive too. I like to reorient folks to recognize that CBD is also psychoactive. It's just not intoxicating. It's non-euphorogenic. But by virtue of it treating epilepsy, by virtue of it, you know, affecting mood, reducing stress, reducing anxiety, those are psychoactive activities. So I always have to say, CBD is psychoactive too. All of the cannabinoids are psychoactive, just to different degrees and in different ways.
Awesome. Thank you so much again for this amazing presentation.